I'm a pulmonary critical care physician at Vanderbilt University and work at the VA. You can see I have gray hair and I've been doing this for 30 years. And I recently, well, 3 years ago, I was asked to be an expert to evaluate 25 cases of patients who had died in an intensive care unit and who had received very large doses of fentanyl and morphine and benzodiazepines and Dilaudid. And what happened over the next couple of years was that they eventually chose to take 14 of those patients to a murder trial. And I became the expert witness for the prosecution. And the defense team, when they got a hold of me on the stand, it was very, very intense. An attack on my beliefs, on my faith, on my practices. And I did not wince or cower in this circumstance, certainly, but I will tell you that it made me very, very uncomfortable. And I completely did not enjoy this experience. It was a terrible experience to go through it. But I knew that I knew the science and the data, and I'm happy to take any questions that any of you have. In general, what happened was that these 14 people that were part of this murder trial, they died a median of 12 minutes after the doctor gave them these injections, 12 minutes. So normally what happens in the ICU is when we make a decision to have someone be made do not resuscitate, that I will write a do not resuscitate order. And I'll write a do not resuscitate note in the chart. And then at a point later in time, a day later, 2 days later, whatever, I will write a decision of withdrawal of support if we're going to withdraw support from somebody who no longer wants life support anymore. And then we let their life take its natural course. And we don't give them anything that would deliberately take their life, but we do allow them to be used. We use good palliative care where we keep their suffering to a minimum. We try and reduce their pain and shortness of breath and so on. And then when the patient dies, could be minutes later, but usually it's hours to days later, if not weeks later, we will then write a third note in the chart that would be a death note. So that's a do not resuscitate note, a withdrawal of support note, and a death note. Well, when I was on the stand, the prosecution put up 14 notes in a row. And this was stunning to me. I'd never seen it in all my time in medicine. All 14 of these people had all three of those notes in one note. The note said, I just made this patient DNR. I just withdrew support, and they're now dead. All in one note, meaning that they all happened simultaneously because the median time to death was 12 minutes. So that, to me, was the scariest thing I'd seen in the whole case. But the amount of drug given was, to give you a frame of reference, I might give somebody 50 mics of fentanyl, and they were getting 2,000 mics of fentanyl. So 20, 30 times the amount of drug that we would normally give a human being. And you could take down a 600-pound to 1,000-pound elephant with these doses of fentanyl. And the way I likened it, and I'll stop talking after I say this analogy, was that it would be if you were in a school zone. They asked me how likely was it that these drugs ended these people's lives. These people were in some form of dying process, like we all are, but they were dying in the next days to weeks or something. But they wanted time with their family, and the families wanted time with them, and they wanted time to resolve relationships and that sort of thing. The way I put it was that if you were in a school zone and you were driving through, and lots of people were crossing the street, lots of kids, parents holding the children's hands. If you were to drive 50 miles an hour through that school zone, you're going to kill somebody. That's how reckless what this was that was done to these people. And I said that on the stand, and I said the thing about the elephants. But at the end of the day, this person got off and didn't get found guilty. And I think that what happened was that there was a combination of the defense team for him making such a case that they were going to die anyway. Therefore, what does it matter if they died in 12 minutes versus 12 days? And also that we didn't know the intent of the doctor. I would argue that you never give these doses unless you were deliberately trying to stop somebody from breathing, and that. But I don't actually know the intent. I didn't ever talk to this doctor. He never told me he was intending to kill them. But I think that somehow the jury got to the point, and the jury was hung. That it was a hung jury, and they said we can't reach a unanimous conclusion. So clearly there were people on both sides of it. But the judge sent them back and said, it's your job, figure it out. And they came back with a unanimous decision to say he was not guilty of murder. I hope that this trial decision, and all of it was in the news. This was on CNN, all the TV stations. It was very well publicized. I hope that what happens is that we use this example to bring about reform so that we have good palliative care, but not reckless palliative care. We reduce human suffering, but we don't do it any way you want. We have rules and boundaries. So those are my thoughts. Alex, thank you for having me on today. It's a privilege to be here with all of you. And I'm here to help answer any questions. And I appreciate all of you for being here today.
Well, Dr. Ely, first of all, you spoke about the specific case of the from Ohio of the physician who you were involved with in this case, who had been charged with all these counts. But in the regular situation, there's concerns that a lot of families have. I'll get calls, contacted saying that people are concerned with the proper use of drugs as people are approaching the end of life in order to keep them comfortable. Can you talk a little bit about, you mentioned, of course, that in this case, the fentanyl was so much more than would ever be used that it seemed obvious, but is obviously there's no complete black and white, but is there, can you talk a little bit about the difference between the use of drugs to keep people comfortable to die naturally, and the use of drugs to cause death when it seems to be becoming intentional, that it's an intentional overdose, or it appears to be an intentional overdose?
Sure, I will, Alex. Just 1 second. I just pulled up the chat, and Ellen Kelly, I appreciate you so much writing what you wrote in there. You said, Ellen, that the article I wrote, What Happens When a Patient Says, Doc, Help Me Die, has helped your graduate students. And if others wish to look for that, you could just type in Wes Ely, CNN. I think it was published on CNN, I believe. Wes Ely, CNN, you'll find that article. But that was an article where, and this answers your question, Alex, where somebody said to me, Dr. Ely, can you help me die? Can you help kill me? And if you find this piece, and maybe somebody can put the link in the chat or something, you'll see that I said to him, and it made me sick to my stomach, that he asked me that, but I said to him, I don't have the right to do that. I don't have the right to accelerate your death. Your life is priceless, and you're of inestimable worth. And so, but I will be with you. And I said, what I want you to hear is that I will stay with you, and that I will not leave you. And I will make you comfortable where you will not suffer. I will not have you in pain or shortness of breath. And I'll try and be with you. But we can't, there's a bright line above which is where intent occurs. So if my arm is suffering, here's a good example. I'll undo my cuff here. If my arm is suffering, and this is how much treated suffering there is with my cloth here, and this is untreated suffering. What I want to do is get the drugs to where I cover the suffering, only that much. But once I cover it, I need to stop and not give more. So in these cases with William Husel, if you had given 100, 150, even maybe 200 of fentanyl, you could cover that pain and suffering and have the suffering taken care of. But when you start giving it out here into 1,000, 2,000, you don't need to cover the suffering's covered. So now you're only giving it to shorten a life. And there are lots of ways that we can reduce human suffering without being out there in the danger zone of deliberately shortening life. And so that's where I want us to learn from one another and say, I'm here, Ms. Smith, I'm here to serve you. I'm here to reduce your suffering, but I'm never here to harm you. I'm never here to harm you. You can be 100% sure that as your physician, I will be here to help you and never to harm you. And I'll say in my, I wrote this book this year. It's called Every Deep Drawn Breath. I refer to it as EDDB. But if you just go Wes Ely, Amazon or something, you'll find this book. But in this book, I wrote this entrance as my wife. Hi, Kimmy. My wife's a physician too. I wrote this in the author note. If you don't mind my reading it. Many people believe medicine is grounded in benevolence, that is, wishing good. It is more than that. The target principle of medicine must be a higher standard, beneficence, doing good. This breeds trust between my patient and me, which is the cornerstone of my art and practice. In return for her trust, I promise always to try to help her and never harm her. Every time I step into the hospital, I remind myself of the enormity of this promise, this covenant. So that, I think, is the crux of the matter, is am I adhering to this covenant? What are you thinking, Alex, or anybody else?
Well, we have a few more in chat. I
Go
think you
ahead.
did deal with the one, how could they not deliver a guilty verdict with that massive amount of drugs? And you had already said that the problem is that the defense focused on intent and tried to make it sound like, well, the physician did not have intent to kill, when in fact you were arguing that that amount of drug could only mean intent. But that's what they focused on, was intent, right?
Let me further elaborate on this. So I have a very good friend in Israel named Charlie Sprung, Sprung. He's a very famous end-of-life researcher. And he's written some very famous studies that were analyses of how this is done in Europe, Israel, Asia, America, et cetera. And there is a gray zone of palliative care. And I think that Husel fell outside of that gray zone. I think it was fairly clear. And Charlie said to me after the trial was over, he said, sometimes doses speak for themselves. And in this case, I think the dose speaks for itself. It was too much. You can't justify giving this much drug to a human being when they're not on a ventilator. Remember, if you're in the OR on a ventilator or in the ICU and I give that amount of drug, I'm going to keep breathing for you. But these people were given that drug after being taken off the ventilator. It's 100% going to shut down their breathing, and they are going to die. So that's the answer that I give you about that. I saw another question that said, would you comment on terminal sedation? Not my field, but I think it's wrong. Thank you for your clear comments. Well, there are, hold on, I can hear Greg. My wife and we're primary caregivers for her brother who's Down syndrome. He's 58 with Down syndrome. He's a beautiful person. And I hear him coming home. Hey, Greg. He might pop his head in here in a minute. Anyway, don't think of terminal sedation as automatically bad. It's not automatically bad. Terminal sedation refers to the fact that if we think somebody is very actively dying, meaning hours to days, that we can use some amount of sedation to make sure that they are not in pain. It's that same thing I did with my arm with the sling, just some amount of sedation to keep them comfortable at these terminal stages of their life. If you're though out here, then it's wrong. That you no longer have the intent of reducing human suffering. So that's what it comes down to: is are we reducing human suffering with this sedation, or have we already reduced the suffering and now we're just out in la la land deliberately shortening life? In which case, no, I would never support that.
There was the question earlier about did these patients have cancer or chronic conditions?
Some of them had cancer, some of them had head bleeds. Some of them had very bad drug addictions. There was a real smorgasbord. Some of them had sepsis from infected kidneys or lungs. There was a whole smorgasbord amongst the 14 people of different diseases.
The question about how can we protect our loved ones, etc. Well, EPC USA does have advanced directives for all 50 states, and you can email us, and we're happy to provide that for you. There's different ones for different states. That's not a perfect answer, because obviously in these cases, when you have intentional overdose and things like that, or alleged intentional overdose, then obviously speaking, it's not the same thing. You have something in your power of attorney document, but obviously that doesn't reflect what's
I love
happening to the
Christine
person.
Zahner's question. She asks, what reforms do you propose that could rule out an evil intent or lying about their intent? That's a great question. I think that what happened here with Husel was that nobody was watching what he was doing, and he was giving orders that nurses were carrying out. It actually happened to be one of his third wife, that was one of the nurses delivering these drugs. So that's kind of a lot involvement there. But I think what we need is we check a set of cross checks and balances so that when somebody writes an order for drugs at the end of life, somebody else reviews and approves or disapproves of that order. And we have to watch what each other are doing. And in this case, time after time after time, these high doses were given and people were delivering the drugs until pharmacists at the hospital started raising the red flags and saying, wait a minute, what? Why are we giving 1,000, 2,000 mics of fentanyl? Nobody does that. And finally, they reached enough of a clarion call that people stopped. The next person, Marcia Joyner writes, did the person or family sign the DNR and did Husel sign for them? He met, so what he did was he met, usually it was at night. He would meet with the family. He would tell them, they're doing very poorly. Let's do a DNR. The family agreed to the DNR, never agreed to the quantity of these drugs. And so they were signed, but then, so that's where normally I would write a DNR note. And then over days and hours and days, or maybe even a week sometimes, we'd write other notes of updating. But in this case, all 3 notes were in one note, which was, I made up a DNR, I withdrew support, they're now dead. All in the same notes. Absolutely crazy. I mean, I've never seen that in clinical practice. Any other questions? Please, you can unmute and ask. We're here to share with one another.
If you want to unmute, you can, and then you can ask a direct question. If you put your hand up, I'll recognize that too.
Cynthia Perry writes, my father was given 4 shots in the last 24 hours. I was sitting at the bedside. I feel he was overdosed. Hold on. Hey, Greg. No. Come meet everybody. Come here. Come say hi. Hey, Greg. How was your day, Greg?
Hi, Greg. How are you, Greg?
Hi. Have a good day? Yeah. Oh, good. I love you. Okay, go get some tea, Greg. Isn't he great?
Yes.
Say hi to him. I feel he was overdosed. What does the dying person present to give a clue to overdosing? Well, yeah, so are you being overdosed? The question is just this. When somebody is actively dying, yourself and ask the caregiver, what evidence do we have of ongoing suffering? Does he look like he's in pain? Does she look like she's short of breath? Does she look overly anxious? Ask the patient too. Are you worried? How much are you suffering? And have the person engage with you or family engage. Now, once everybody feels like that the suffering is covered, that you've covered the suffering, and no, we don't see pain. We don't see shortness of breath. We don't see these problems. Then you can say, well, we're doing fine then. Let's give whatever we're giving now. Let's keep giving that at the same interval because we've got it right. Titrate that. And then if pain comes and emerges, say, well, you know what? We're gonna have to go up a little bit now. So this is just a work in progress at the bedside of love, of delivering love. That's the main thing you're trying to deliver is love.
Okay, sorry, I just wanted to, it's Cynthia, just finishing off that question was that in the last 24 hours, he was basically, comatose or whatever. So I couldn't engage in conversation. So I was just watching them administer the shots every 4 hours or so. So the last part of that question was, is it permitted to ask them how many milligrams of what drug they're administering each time?
Yes, it is permitted. And what I could suggest is right off the bat, it is not wrong to give these medicines every 4 hours. Some of these drugs only last 2 hours. And so to keep the patient out of pain, oftentimes we do give the drugs every 4 hours. So the interval is not the issue. But the key is how much are you giving now? And did you try less? Was less not effective? When we gave less, was there obvious pain and obvious suffering? And that's the question is where were we and where did we go? And that's what happened with Husel is that he went straight to 1,000, straight to 2,000. There was no 50, 100, 150. And so that's the key is that there wasn't that pattern over time.
Dr. Ely, isn't it also indicative of a problem if they give them an injection, but let's say the first injection, and the person immediately becomes sedated to the point where you cannot communicate with them, that they've been given too much?
If the person can't communicate after that first injection, the question should be raised, next time, can we give half that dose?
Okay,
Okay.
Mhm.
Next time, can we give half the dose?
because we get calls and stories from people that, you know, the hospice nurse came, gave my loved one an injection, and I was never able to talk to him again.
Right. And it may be that clinically that was required to get that person out of suffering, or it may be that if we give the next dose at half the dose, that we can now engage with them, because many people do want that time of consciousness. And if the one drug overshot, it doesn't mean anybody deliberately did anything wrong, but it does mean that we could ask the question, should we give less next time?
Okay.
Any other
Another
questions?
thought I
Oh,
wanted to
sorry.
ask you about in terms of reforms coming out of this case is, and I think, you know, in this case, the legal system was looking for kind of a bright line test where you could say, if you go over 250, it's too much, period, you know, like across the board, which I understand is not realistic. But would it be possible to establish a line? Let's just use 250 for purposes of discussion. And if somebody wants to go over that, then you have to have a second physician, you know, review and approve, or what, you know, some kind of a process like that.
Yes to the process, no to the line. And the reason is that there are many people in the hospital who build up such a dependence on these drugs that you have to go higher than 250. There's no question that there are people in the hospital getting 250 an hour of fentanyl on a ventilator. Okay. The difference in Husel was they weren't on a ventilator, but so we go to high doses sometimes, but it needs to be gradual over time that we had to get to that. And it needs to be not just a jump. And so it's all about pattern and attempts to reduce and attempts to go more modest. And then what's the goal of the patient? Is this person want awake and with their loved ones, or are they in so much pain that the only way to get them out of the pain is that they're going to have a depressed level of consciousness? So those are some things that we have to take into play here. Are these lethal doses happening in other hospitals? I think that Husel was an outlier. I don't think that that's happening at other hospitals on a regular basis. I think the Husel case has called this to attention on a national level. And somebody, Ellen Kelly, asked, have we developed protocols? Absolutely, we have protocols. We have palliative care protocols, and they're getting better all the time. In this case, this hospital did not have such protocols and boundaries in place. And that's why this was allowed to happen. And it was a travesty. And we need to not let that be repeated.
Well, clearly, we all know that he murdered those people, and that amount of fentanyl, being that it's 100 times stronger than morphine, that they did kill. Does the family have any other alternative to go after him on their own? Or is this just over? Is there an appeal?
No, it's not over. Good point, Marcia. No, it's definitely not over. He will be in civil cases for the next 5 to 10 years. They're stacked up. There's like 20 cases right now. They're all suing him in civil court.
Good.
Yeah, 100%. This is going to keep going for a long time. So he's not going to be in jail, but I don't think he'll ever practice medicine again. If he does, I'll be surprised. And that sends a strong signal to other doctors: beware. You can't just go do whatever you want. And I think he's totally broke.
Sadly, it seems like he got away with it. Now, I'm glad to hear that the families are going after him, but for them to come back and give a not guilty verdict for all of those, even though there was a hung jury at some point, to come back and give a not guilty verdict for all of us, I'm sure as well as you, we were shocked, because this makes it look like no matter what somebody does, it's okay. Because we've seen this in hospice going on, people shortening their life, hastening death, euthanasia against anybody's consent. And it's been going on for decades. So this, for him to be found not guilty makes it look like to other people, it's, you know, go do whatever you want to do. There is going to be no consequence.
I hear what you're saying, and I will tell you that there are many people in the medical system outraged by the situation, and on a national level, the societies that do critical care are taking this very seriously and have already been emailing me saying, let's incorporate what we learned here to protect people in the future.
Good.
Yeah.
Hello?
Yes, please.
Yes, hi there. Yeah, I have a question. Do you know anything about the composition of the jury? Like, was there any physicians on the jury?
I have zero idea. I mean, I looked at them multiple days in a row. They were of all colors, shapes, and sizes, but I have no idea about any of their faith values, secular, non-secular, any of those beliefs at all. I don't know. What multimodal, non-opioid, or minimally sedating analgesics can the patient family request to be used? There are very, very good non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like Toradol, for example. Tordal is a really good option for pain relief, which is injectable. And it's as good as opiates in many circumstances. Some people can't take that because they might have ulcers or something like that, but that's one example of that. So there are other options, and your doctors can try those. There's also IV, IV forms of Tylenol and non-steroidal. So you have both of those available for pain relief.
Any other questions?
I appreciate being here with you today, and I appreciate your prayers. And if you want to read about this recovery, about a lot of these things in this book, Every Deep Drawn Breath, please feel free to email me, but you can get this anywhere books are sold. And I don't make a penny off this book. Every penny from this book is being given into an endowment for survivors of critical illness. So it's called Every Deep Drawn Breath. And all the money goes to survivors of critical illness and their family members. And there's a lot of this is literature and poetry, and there's a resources section at the back for families on how to avoid delirium, for example, when you want to talk to your loved ones and have engagement. We have lots of stuff about that in there, but it's narrative nonfiction, and all the stories in there are true, real names, real people, and real quotes. So I hope you find your heart on those pages. And if you do it, email me and let me know anytime. I'd love to engage with you.
What is your email?
My email is wes.ely, WES.ELY @VUMC.org, VUMC.org. And I'm on Twitter @WesElyMD. And I'm only on Twitter for two reasons: love and science.
Very good.
Thank you, Alex, for having me.
No, thank you.
Thank
for
you
joining us.
for coming
Thank you so
on and
much.
joining
Thanks,
us.
everybody.
Thank you so much,
Excellent.
Doctor. We really
Have a
And
good
I
day.
wanted
Take care.
to just finish with a very quick story. So I got a call a couple weeks ago from a woman who was approved for MAID, euthanasia in Canada. She called me because one of our supporters, someone like you, she had been talking to that person, and she must have said she was approved for, we call it MAID here in Canada, even though I don't. It's euthanasia, but MAID's a nice term to make us all feel good about killing.
Yeah.
So anyway, so she calls me and she's talking to me. Why? Because she's now having second thoughts because she spoke to one of our supporters and she was thinking maybe euthanasia is not a good idea. But what is it? She's a woman who's older. Yes, she does have cancer. Yes, she's got very bad arthritis, so she can't really walk very much anymore. But she's very poor. She's very, very poor. She has very little food. She has a very hard time. She can't do her laundry, things like that, because she's got no way to do it. She's not walking properly anymore. She's in an apartment. All this. So she was asking for death, not because she was seeking to end her life, but because her living conditions had become so bad, she had come to some decision that death might be better than living.
Hmm.
So after discussing her situation and everything, we're trying to find help for her, and that's what we're doing. So now she's saying she wants to live, and you find out these interesting things when you're talking to someone. This is a woman who had finished her poetry book, but it has never been published. Or she's saying, I just didn't want to die before my poetry book is published. She's saying these kind of things to me, and yet you're thinking, but she's, you understand where she's coming from because she was distraught by her life condition. And so I always throw this at people when we're talking about euthanasia and assisted suicide. The other side talks about autonomy, freedom, choice, my decision. And then you think of Murray. She's a poor woman. She doesn't want to die. She wants to live. Well, she wants to live until she dies. But her conditions have been so poor, she was thinking maybe death was better than life. And so these are the kind of things we have to put in our mind when we're talking about these issues. The other side wants to sell you something which is, it's not necessarily the everyday reality of the person who's seeking death. And I'm throwing that at you on purpose for another reason, that we've had a few cases in Canada now of people with chemical sensitivities who are living in social housing because they have a disability, they're living in poverty, they've got chemical sensitivity issues, and they're being approved for euthanasia. They're not terminal, they're not dying, but they can't live the way they are living, and they're being approved for euthanasia. And so you're thinking, how could that be? Sadly, that's the way the world goes once you allow killing. It becomes more and more and more. So the reality is we have to look at what Dr. Ely has said about the importance of that person. And that's how I've been speaking to this woman who's been calling me back, and I've been calling her. I keep saying, but your life is important. That's what matters, is that your life is important. And so this is what it's about, right? It's about the individual.
Alex, it's a great story. It's an important story, and we have to allow each person to find their why to live. And that's a beautiful story you just share with us. Christine Zahner asked a different thing about two different drugs. I'll just mention these, and then I'll let y'all go. Ketamine and dexmedetomidine. Dexmedetomidine is a very helpful medication in the ICU. It does not suppress the respiratory drive, so it doesn't stop people from breathing, but it does calm them down, and they can engage with you and interact. It's a very good drug because it allows you to interact with somebody as they're dying and yet keep them calm. It has some analgesic qualities. The ketamine it's helpful for some people, but other people it causes a dissociative cognitive problem like delirium. So some people it works really well and some people it doesn't. So that's more of a mixed bag there. But let's all keep talking. Let's keep helping one another realize that we don't know everything, and we're here to learn from one another. And I appreciate all of you and would love for you to be praying for me to gain wisdom and prudence. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank
Bye-bye.
you, everyone.